Well, the ugly truth about experts is that their authority is a flimsy illusion, a shaky tower built on fancy degrees, smooth talk, and a remarkable talent for dodging the consequences of their own failures. These are folks who strut around claiming they can fix problems they've never bothered to understand, cooking up policies that sound grand in a seminar room, but fall apart the minute they hit the real world. They're not driven by facts or common sense. They're propelled by what I've long called the vision of the anointed, a smug conviction that they're smarter and nobler than the rest of us, entitled to remake society in their image. And who gets stuck with the bill when their brilliant ideas crash and burn? Not them, never them. It's the ordinary people, the ones who don't have the luxury of hiding behind a title or a podium. See, a surgeon who botches a heart operation loses his license. An engineer who designs a bridge that collapses loses his job and maybe his freedom. But these self-appointed experts, the ones in government offices, university ivory towers, and media studios who wreck whole communities, economies, or generations with their schemes, they just dust themselves off, write another book about why it wasn't their fault, and move on to the next disaster. Their influence is vast, their accountability is nil, and that's the rotten core of the problem. They wield power without ever having to answer for the wreckage they leave behind. Now, let's be clear about who I'm talking about here. I don't mean the mechanic who can rebuild your engine or the farmer who knows exactly when to sow his fields. Those are people with real hard-earned knowledge, tested every day by results you can see and touch. No, I'm pointing at the intellectual class, the bureaucrats, the professors, the talking heads, who think they've got the magic formula for solving big, messy things like poverty, crime, or education, all without ever getting their hands dirty. These are the types who sit in cushy offices and dictate how the rest of us should live, work, and raise our kids, ignoring the basic laws of human nature and economics like they're optional. They don't deal in concrete realities. They traffic in abstractions, theories, and a dangerous faith in their own brilliance. History's a junkyard full of their flops, piles of evidence they refuse to look at because it doesn't fit their story. And that's what we're here to unpack, how these experts keep peddling their nonsense, how it keeps failing, and why we'd all be better off if we stopped listening to them and started trusting the messy, practical wisdom of people making their own choices. Take urban planning in the mid-20th century as a prime example, an absolute disaster dressed up as progress by these so-called experts. In the 1940s and 50s, they got it into their heads that they could renew America's cities, wipe away the slums, and create gleaming modern utopias. They looked at neighborhoods in places like the South Bronx, Chicago's Near West Side, or St. Louis's Pruitt-to-Go area, and saw poverty, yes, but also chaos they thought they could tame with their blueprints and bulldozers. So they tore down functioning communities, poor, sure, but alive with small businesses, churches, and social networks that held people together, and replaced them with towering public housing projects. The idea was to concentrate the poor into these sterile high-rise boxes and call it progress. What did they get? By the 1970s, Pruitt-Igoe was a national symbol of failure, vandalized, crime-ridden, and abandoned, demolished in 1972, just 18 years after it opened. In New York, the South Bronx became a byword for urban collapse, with arson and gang violence so bad that 40% of its housing stock was lost between 1970 and 1980. Crime in public housing projects across the country was double or triple that of surrounding areas by the late 70s. Take Chicago's Cabrini Green, where murders and assaults skyrocketed as families fled. Why did this happen? Because the experts ignored the organic order of human life, how people actually live, work, and survive in communities built from the ground up. They thought society was a machine they could engineer, not a living system with its own logic. And who paid the price? Black communities, disproportionately. Before this meddling, places like Harlem in the 1920s had poverty. 87% of blacks lived below the poverty line in 1940. But they also had thriving businesses, low crime, and intact families, with 75% of kids raised in two-parent homes. By 1980, after decades of expert-driven renewal and welfare expansion, that number had dropped to 58%, and the social fabric was in tatters. The experts didn't lift people up. They tore the ladder out from under them and called it compassion. Now let's turn to economics. Where the expert class has done some of its most persistent damage, minimum wage laws being a glaring case in point. The idea sounds wonderful on paper, mandate higher wages, and everyone's better off. Could argue with that, but reality doesn't bend to good intentions, and economics isn't a morality play. When you artificially raise the price of labor, employers don't just shrug and pay it. They hire less or they hire differently. And who gets squeezed out? The least skilled, the least experienced, often young black workers trying to get a start. Look at the data. In 1948, before widespread federal minimum wage hikes, black teenage unemployment was actually lower than white teenage unemployment, 9.4% versus 10.2%. That's right, lower. Employers hired based on need, not mandates. By 1970, after a decade of minimum wage increases, black teenage unemployment had shot up to 29.1%, while white teenage unemployment was 13.1%. Today, it's even worse. Black youth unemployment routinely hits 15 to 20%, double the rate for whites. The experts will tell you it's racism or lack of opportunity, but that's a dodge. It's supply and demand. If you're a small business owner and the government says you've got to pay $15 an hour for a kid with no skills, you're not going to hire him. You'll hire someone with experience or automate the job instead. That's not prejudice, it's arithmetic. And yet the expert class keeps pushing these laws decade after decade because it feels right. It lets them signal compassion without ever having to face the teenager who can't get his foot in the door. Milton Friedman put it best. One of the great mistakes is to judge policies by their intentions rather than their results. The experts never learn that lesson, and the data keeps piling up. Study after study, from the National Bureau of Economic Research to the Census Bureau, shows minimum wage hikes consistently cut low-skilled jobs. But the experts don't care about data, they care about their image. Crime policy is another arena where the disconnect between expert theories and real life turns deadly, and we've got a long, bloody history to prove it. Back in the 1960s and 70s, progressive criminologists, judges, and social reformers decided that tough sentencing was barbaric and that the answer to crime was rehabilitation, not punishment. They pushed bail reform, lenient parole, reduced incarceration, policies rooted in the idea that criminals were just misunderstood victims of society. What happened? Between 1960 and 1980, the U.S. murder rate doubled from 5.1 to 10.2 per 100,000 people. Cities like Detroit, it hit 45 per 100,000 by the late 70s. Entire neighborhoods turned into war zones. New York City saw murders climb from 681 in 1965 to 1,814 in 1980. Robberies, assaults, burglaries all soared as the experts patted themselves on the back for their enlightenment. They blamed poverty or guns, anything but their own policies. But then, starting in the 90s, states and cities reversed course. New York under Giuliani adopted broken windows, policing, cracking down on small crimes to prevent big ones, and toughened sentencing. California passed 3 strikes laws. Nationally, incarceration rates rose, and guess what? Crime plummeted. By 2014, the U.S. murder rate was back down to 5.4 per 100,000. New York's murders fell to 328 by 2014, less than half the 1965 number. The data is unmistakable. Deterrence works. Yet here we are today, watching the same old expert playbook unfold again. Defund the police, decarceration, soft on crime district attorneys. Look at San Francisco. Shoplifting so rampant that stores are closing. Shootings up 20% in 2021 alone. Chicago's murder rate hit a 25-year high in 2021 with 797 killings. The experts don't live in those neighborhoods. They don't bury the dead or board up the windows. They just write op-eds about systemic injustice and move on. Meanwhile, the people left behind pay with their lives. Education is another field where the experts have wreaked havoc, and it's worth digging into because it shows how their influence seeps into every corner of society. In the 20th century, American public schools were the envy of the world, locally controlled, focused on basics like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Then the progressive education experts got involved, starting in the early 1900s with John Dewey and his disciples. They decided schools weren't about teaching skills, they were about socializing kids, building self-esteem, and experimenting with untested theories. By the 1960s and 70s, you had open classrooms, whole language reading fads, and a rejection of discipline and standards, all pushed by education schools and federal bureaucrats. The result? In 1963, the average SAT score was 980 out of 1,000. By 1990, it had dropped to 900, even as spending per pupil doubled in real terms. International tests today rank U.S. students 38th in math and 24th in science among developed nations, behind countries like Estonia and Vietnam. Black and Hispanic kids who most need solid schools suffer the worst. In 2019, only 17% of black 8th graders were proficient in reading per the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The experts' response? More money, more theories. Never a look at what works. Contrast that with charter schools or voucher programs where parents and markets call the shots. In New York City, Success Academy charter schools, free of union rules and expert fads, have black and Hispanic kids scoring in the top 5% statewide, outpacing wealthy suburbs. The experts hate that because it proves their centralized control isn't the answer. So what's the alternative to all this expert meddling? It's not some new guru or another grand plan. It's letting people make their own decisions. Decentralized knowledge, free markets, personal responsibility. These aren't flashy, but they deliver. Look at history. The Industrial Revolution didn't come from a government committee. It came from inventors, entrepreneurs, and ordinary folks solving problems day by day. In 1800, 94% of the world lived in extreme poverty, less than $1.90 a day in today's terms. By 2015, that was down to 9.6% according to the World Bank. Why? Not because experts dictated it, but because markets, trade, and individual initiative lifted billions out of misery. Compare that to the Soviet Union, central planning by the best and brightest. 5-year plans, expert quotas, and what did they get? Empty shelves, bread lines, and 30 million dead from famine and purges between the 1920s and 50s. The experts had all the power and none of the answers. Or take Mao's Great Leap Forward, another expert-driven fiasco. In 1958, Mao's cadres, armed with theories about collectivized farming, forced peasants into communes and backyard steel furnaces. Result, a famine that killed 20 to 45 million people by 1962, one of the worst man-made disasters in history. The lesson is clear. No one person or group can know enough to run everyone else's life. Friedrich Hayek called it the fatal conceit, the belief that you can plan a society from the top down. Every time it's tried, it fails. And yet the experts keep trying. To wrap this up, let me leave you with 3 essential insights about these experts and their unchecked influence. Insights that have held true across time and keep getting drowned out by their arrogance. First, knowledge is limited, but arrogance isn't. The expert class acts like they've got all the answers, but human systems, economies, cultures, families are too complex for any one mind to master. Their overconfidence breeds catastrophe, whether it's Stalin's collectivization killing millions or America's urban renewal turning neighborhoods into wastelands. The more they claim to know, the more dangerous they become. Second, incentives matter more than intentions. Experts face no penalty for being wrong. If a businessman fails, he's broke. If a farmer's crops die, he starves. But if a bureaucrat or professor fails, he gets a promotion or a bigger budget. That's why their policies keep failing, the same way there's no feedback loop to force correction. Look at welfare. In 1960, 22% of black kids were born out of wedlock. After decades of expert design programs, it's 70% today. No accountability, no change. Third, results trump theories. The graveyard of history is full of expert schemes, price controls that cause shortages, crime policies that coddle criminals and punish victims, education reforms that leave kids illiterate. Meanwhile, the unglamorous stuff, markets, rule of law, individual choice, keeps delivering. In 1900, life expectancy in the U.S. was 47 years. By 2000, it was 77, thanks to private innovation, not government plans. The experts hate that because it doesn't need them. The ugly truth is, these people aren't our saviors. They're often the problem. They thrive on power without responsibility, peddling solutions that sound good but fail hard. We'd do better to trust the collective wisdom of millions making their own calls, flawed, messy, but grounded in reality, than the hubris of a few who think they know it all. History's on my side here. Just look at the numbers, the failures, and the wreckage they've left behind. The evidence is there for anyone willing to see it, but too many are dazzled by the expert's title instead of his track record. That's the real tragedy, and it's why we keep repeating these mistakes.